He grinned when he glanced at my bank statement, said I couldn't even afford a weekend brunch, let alone anything more ambitious. But while he was busy mocking my finances, I was quietly orchestrating the deal that would strip him of his own company. Imagine his face the morning he logged in to check the share registry and saw my name at the top of the list. He'd always assumed power was something you inherited or demanded, not something a broke nobody could quietly seize. Yet there I was, the last person he expected, calling the shots he once believed were his alone. And what he didn't see coming wasn't just a takeover, it was the reckoning, born from every slight, every offhand jab about my bank account. By the time he realized what happened, his empire would already be mine. Stick around, because the story of how I turned his doubt into my biggest advantage is one you won't believe. I still remember the exact moment the facade began to crack. Sitting in the glass-walled conference room, I watched him breeze past my cubicle with that self-satisfied grin, convinced his empire was unshakable. I'd joined Meridian Analytics 2 years earlier as a fresh graduate, clutching my diploma and $20 to my name, convinced that hard work would earn me respect. He'd welcomed me with a patronizing pat on the back, told me I was ambitious, but naive, then steered me to the dusty archives to learn the ropes. I spent nights poring over old balance sheets, memorizing revenue streams, and decoding those coded footnotes everyone else ignored. People saw a junior analyst buried in spreadsheets. I saw patterns that hinted at deeper problem-skewed projections, off-the-books liabilities, and a recurring lump sum in the miscellaneous expenses that no one could explain. Rumor had it that this magic line item paid for lavish after-parties and hush-money settlements whenever a vendor squealed. No one cared enough to ask if those parties ever translated into real growth, or whether those settlements hid something more sinister. Meanwhile, the boss would take the stage at quarterly town halls, hawking his latest strategic vision. A well-rehearsed monologue of buzzwords that masked the company's true condition. He bragged about 20% annual growth, yet I saw the client churn statistics climbing like a trapdoor opening. Every slide he presented was an exercise in theatrical confidence graphs, colored in optimistic blues, trend lines pointing straight up, but beneath that veneer, the foundations were shifting. I began tracking employee departures in the margins of my notebook. A senior account manager here, a veteran developer there, all citing culture fit or career stagnation, but none willing to point the finger at the strategic missteps he kept boasting about. At first, I chalked it up to normal turnover. Every firm had its hiccups, right? But when the head of compliance vanished without warning, rumor said he'd threatened to expose the shell companies funneling money offshore, realized the cracks weren't merely cosmetic. The compliance team's files had gone missing just days before an internal audit, leaving no paper trail for those hush money flows. I watched as his inner circle scrambled to patch the leaks, frantic email chains with cryptic subject lines, last-minute board memos pushed through without review. A new CFO parachuted in from another firm with a reputation for fixing failing companies. Yet the fixes never stuck. Each time the boardroom door swung shut, I could almost hear the wooden frames splintering under the weight of ignored warnings. And still, the boss stood there smiling, unaware or perhaps willfully blind, while the pillars beneath him slowly rotted. I knew then that the company was teetering on the edge of collapse, propped up by debt covenants and hollow promises. But what surprised me most wasn't how blind he was to the decay. It was how eager everyone else was to follow his lead, afraid to challenge the narrative for fear of losing their golden ticket to the top. So I began to map out every weakness. The legal department overworked and under-resourced, desperate to keep litigation at bay. The marketing team chasing vanity metrics instead of sustainable growth. The IT infrastructure so outdated that a single server breach could doom the entire network. Late nights found me sketching organizational charts, drawing arrows to these weak nodes like a strategist planning a siege. Once, I even warmed up my car in the parking lot at 6 a.m. pretending to be asleep, just so I could peer through the executive elevator's frosted glass and count the tech gadgets littering his desk. Proof of his distraction, he had no idea. I was watching that every careless gesture told a story of extravagance and complacency. Then came the whisper campaigns, hints of a whistleblower in the finance division, murmurs that someone had flagged suspicious transactions to the SEC. The walls had ears, and I heard enough to know the boss was scrambling to keep the board from finding out. When he appeared on Bloomberg to reassure investors, his confident tone struck me as brittle, like someone trying to sell a ship riddled with termites. By the time I stepped out of that conference room, I carried more than reports. I carried conviction. I realized that while he laughed about my broke status, he was the one standing on bankrupt ground. What everyone saw as stability was nothing more than a mirage built on misdirection. And as the initial sandals of cracks in his empire widened, I began to assemble the tools I'd need. Discreet conversations with sympathetic insiders, researching shell company registries at the Public Records Office, and quietly lining up potential backers who would believe in my vision of a truly transparent, data-driven firm. By the end of that week, the company I'd once thought of as an immovable mountain looked more like a sandcastle at high tide, beautiful, impressive, but utterly doomed to collapse unless someone rebuilt it from the ground up. And if he couldn't see it, that was his greatest vulnerability. But that vulnerability was about to become my greatest advantage. I never saw it coming until the annual company retreat, when he stood on that makeshift stage with a mic in one hand and an arrogant smile plastered on his face, and casually dropped the line that would become a grenade in my life. "I've checked her profile. Let's just say she couldn't buy her way out of a paper bag." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then rippled with uncomfortable chuckles as colleagues shifted in their seats. I felt my chest tighten, my face flush, because while everyone else laughed it off as harmless banter, I knew exactly what he'd done. He'd taken years of careful work, reduced it to a punchline, and planted the first seed of doubt in every mind in that room. From that moment on, whispers followed me down the hallways. "Is she really as broke as he said?" I heard. "She maxed out her credit cards in college. Who trusts their money, let alone their career, to someone with that kind of background?" No one asked me, they just assumed the rumor was true. I started noticing closed-door meetings whenever I passed by, overheard snippets of conversations trailing off as soon as I approached. Clients who once greeted me with warm handshakes began offering only cursory nods. The boss's words weren't merely careless, they were strategic. He was the company's founder, its public face, and by undermining my credibility at a moment when I'd begun to shine, he ensured no one would question his version of reality. That moment felt like a fracture line snaking through my confidence, but it also ignited something in me. I resolved that I wouldn't let his cheap shot define me. Instead, I'd turn it into a weapon of my own making. First, I cataloged every time his rumor had succeeded in cutting me out. A promotion gone to someone less qualified. A project assignment rerouted before it even reached my inbox. Budgets slashed whenever my name appeared on the staffing list. I saved emails, noted dates, and logged every performance review where the same undercurrent of doubt slithered into the text. Then I began testing the water. At an off-site brainstorming session, I stepped forward with a proposal for a new analytics tool that could boost client retention by identifying at-risk accounts before they left an idea. So obvious. It made the other teams gape. But when I presented the forecasted ROI, one team lead muttered under his breath, "Sure, if our resident pauper can find investors for it." The room froze again, then erupted into scattered laughter. This time, though, I was ready. I paused, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Funny you mention investors because I'm working with a group that's ready to put real capital behind this project. Not just empty buzzwords." The laughter died on the spot. I went on to explain how I'd quietly lined up seed funding through angel networks he'd always dismissed as too niche, and how I'd already secured letters of intent. I could feel the shift in the air, curiosity replacing mockery, but he wouldn't back down. In the very next quarterly meeting, he took the microphone again and announced an internal audit into my financial affiliations, suggesting I might owe undisclosed fees to external consultants. It was a blatant attempt to paint me as a liability. The board chair touched his earpiece, eyebrows knitting together, and I knew the rumor was gaining traction at the highest level. My stomach churned because suddenly it wasn't just casual gossip among colleagues, it was official. I was under a microscope. Papers were pulled, expenses rehashed, and for a week, my every transaction was under review. I sat in that sterile audit room watching as my carefully tracked spreadsheets were combed through by an external auditor whose every question dripped with skepticism. "Why did you split that vendor payment into two smaller ones? Who authorized this wire transfer? Can you prove this was for company business and not personal expense?" And all the while, I answered calmly, providing invoices, contracts, and emails that traced every dollar. By the time the audit team presented their findings to the board, they confirmed not a single policy had been breached. My finances were airtight. The damage was done. The rumor had spread like wildfire. Clients asked their account managers if they could trust that analyst. Peers who once shared inside jokes turned cold, avoiding eye contact in the hallways as if proximity risked contagion. I felt the walls close in, and I realized that no amount of facts would erase the power of his carefully planted lie. So I shifted strategy. I didn't just defend myself, I went on offense. I started dropping my own questions at every meeting. How's our debt service coverage ratio trending after that last bond issuance? Have we considered the tax implications of that offshore subsidiary? Each question was designed to reveal a gap in his oversight, a hole he'd ignored because he never believed anyone would notice. Rumors began to swirl about his own financial recklessness, a year-old merger that had quietly cost the company millions, a vendor bribe scandal that someone was investigating in the background. No direct accusations, just pointed queries that made people lean in. And as the whispers about his missteps grew, the whispers about my supposed poverty faded into the background, replaced by a new narrative. Maybe she's the one with the real insight. Then came the turning point. At the firm's annual gala, he took the stage again, this time to toast our most promising rising star, a line he'd read off a script, a line he meant for someone else. The slip was so subtle that only a handful of insiders noticed, but those insiders were the board members, the senior partners, the decision makers. They exchanged loaded looks, a silent acknowledgement that his control might be slipping. And although he recovered, instantly lifting his glass with practiced ease, the moment marked the beginning of the end for his unchallenged reign. By the time the after-party rolled around, the small talk had shifted. People speculated and hushed. Tones about who would be tapped for the next CFO role, whose name was floating in the rumor mill as a potential successor. And in a quiet corner, a senior director leaned over and said to me, "You've got the vision this place needs. Don't let one misguided jab keep you in the shadows." That night I understood. The smear campaign that had nearly buried me had also exposed the cracks in his armor. It had rallied the very people he needed to keep him safe, people who no longer believed in his infallibility. The joke he made at my expense had sown the seeds of his downfall. And while he saw me as the underdog, the powerless junior, I had become the insurgent threat he never anticipated. That was the moment I realized the battle for reputation was won or lost, long before any numbers hit the balance. Sheet hand, I was ready for my revenge. The next phase was lining up preliminary board support. I started by identifying directors who had grown frustrated with the CEO's overconfidence and the mounting operational risks we'd unearthed. At one discreet fundraiser in Soho, I engaged the audit committee chair in conversation about a mutual contact in the compliance division. He admitted that he'd raised concerns about the offshore settlements, but was repeatedly shut down. One listened, sympathized, and gently broached the idea that perhaps the board needed fresh eyes, someone with deep knowledge of both the spreadsheets and the shadowy corners of the business. He didn't commit, but his interest was piqued. Then, at a board members' gallery opening, I cornered the risk oversight lead and laid out a few anecdotes about unaddressed IT vulnerabilities. I emphasized that a modest injection of capital, neither flashy nor publicized, could secure the infrastructure for years. He scribbled notes on a gallery brochure and promised to bring it up at the next governance meeting. Meanwhile, I circulated a whispered rumor that one particular board member was considering flipping allegiance. It was a half-truth I'd discovered through conversation that he was unhappy with the CEO's aggressive M&A strategy and quietly exploring alternatives. I let the rumor slip in offhand comments to a trusted few. I heard Mark's been having private talks with some activist investor, I'd say, allowing my voice to drop. Within days, speculation began to swirl in the hallways. Mark's office door saw a steady stream of visitors, each angling to curry favor with the man who could tip the balance of power. The CEO noticed and sent an assistant to find out what was happening, but the assistant returned with nothing more than a puzzled shrug. That confusion was exactly what I wanted: uncertainty and doubt. Creeping into the CEO's domain with the shells funded and board sentiment softening, I needed the critical piece: proxy votes. The company's bylaws required a simple majority for any controlling change, but those votes had to come from shareholders, many of whom were small, silent investors that rarely exercised their rights publicly. I sent a discreet email to each shell's account manager, instructing them to record the votes but to refrain from any direct communication with the company. Simultaneously, I cultivated relationships with a handful of high-net-worth individuals who held modest stakes, people the CEO had always overlooked because they lacked clout. I met one such investor, a retired tech founder, at a golf club. Over lunch, I laid out a vision. The company was steering toward a cliff unless someone challenged the status quo. He agreed to support me, intrigued by the idea of safeguarding the legacy of a firm he'd once admired. While I marshaled these forces, I maintained my outward role as the dutiful analyst, volunteering for extra tasks and speaking up about minor process improvements, so no one suspected I was anything more than another hardworking underling. In fact, I leaned into that persona, letting him see me as harmless, someone he could underestimate. One afternoon, he asked me to stay late to help finalize a board presentation. I smiled and agreed, the flicker of his confidence in my loyalty both infuriating and exhilarating. As I left the building at 9 p.m., I stopped by his office, tapped on his half-glass door, and said quietly, "Great presentation tomorrow, sir. You'll ace it." He looked up, grinned, and waved me away. He had no idea that his own board would use my notes against him just hours later. The final piece fell into place when I activated a contingency plan I'd prepared months earlier, a surprise proxy filing. The shells I'd set up filed a notice with the corporate registry just after market close on a Friday, indicating that they intended to nominate a slate of 5 independent directors. The filing went public Monday morning, sending shockwaves through the investor community. Overnight, the stock price wavered as analysts scrambled to interpret the move. The CEO's phone lines lit up with calls from worried board members demanding explanations. He held an emergency strategy session, but by then it was too late. My silent investors had already cast their votes, and the board members I'd quietly courted shifted to my side or at least refused to back him. The coup had been executed with the elegance of a well-choreographed heist. On Tuesday, during the special meeting, the Shells and allied investors representing just over 51% voted to replace the entire executive team, including the CEO himself. As the vote was tallied, I sat in the back row.com and composed, watching the man who once sneered at my finances slump in his chair, shock etched on his face. He tried to speak, to defend his record, but the chairman cut him off and announced, "The new leadership slate?" In that moment, I realized that every covert step I'd taken, the shell entities, the silent investors, the whispered rumors, the proxy votes had fused into a single unstoppable current. He had believed his power was unassailable, anchored in his public persona and long-standing alliances. Yet his greatest mistake was underestimating the quiet strategist who had studied every crack in his armor. And now, as whispers of my name spread through the room, some in disbelief, others with grudging respect, the company was mine to guide, and his reign was over. The night the takeover actually happened, it felt less like a hostile raid and more like the quiet click of a lock surrendering under the right key. I had planned everything for months, but the real magic was in the timing. I waited for the market to close on a Friday when trading volume was low and eyes drifted toward weekend headlines. As the last bell rang at 4 p.m., my network of shell companies quietly filed the necessary ownership filings with the exchange, each one registering just under the threshold that would have automatically alerted regulators or spooked other shareholders. By the time Monday's opening bell echoed across trading floors, our combined stake had crept past 51%, enough to seize control without ever raising a red flag. While most traders were sipping coffee and scrolling through weekend headlines, the change had already rippled through the company's shareholder registry, the name they'd always associated with the underdog. Analyst quietly became the one in bold type next to controlling shareholder. Early Monday, as analysts tried to reconcile that overnight shift, the CEO arrived at headquarters expecting a routine board meeting. Instead, he found the boardroom door locked, and a letter slid under the official notice that he had been deposed, that new directors would be elected, and that I would be interim CEO effective immediately. He stood in the corridor staring at the brass plaque as if it had sprouted overnight, hands trembling around his briefcase. Inside, the board was already voting. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table.com and collected with the governance committee chair at my left and the audit lead, both allies I had courted, on my right. It was surreal. The very people who had once dismissed me as a junior analyst were now casting votes to replace the man who had once been their fearless leader. He pounded on the door for a moment, then walked away without a word, his empire slipping through his fingers before he could even process the betrayal. As the meeting concluded, I rose to address the room. I didn't gloat or raise my voice. I simply outlined the reasons for the change, the concealed liabilities, the misreported revenues, the decades of unchecked mismanagement that I had laid bare in detailed memos that now lay before every director. I explained that our first order of business would be a thorough, transparent audit, followed by a restructured executive team and renewed focus on long-term stability over short-term optics. The board nodded, some with relief, others with cautious optimism. They'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. Word of the takeover leaked to the press within hours. Headlines ranged from rookie analyst appends corporate throne to quiet coup at Meridian Analytics. Investors reacted swiftly. The stock wavered, dipped, then began climbing as traders realized the newfound transparency would likely stabilize revenue and restore client trust. Employees who'd felt the tremors of misdirection for years flooded my inbox with messages of support and relief. I replied personally to each one, promising open forums for feedback and inviting them to join a town hall meeting later that afternoon, another first in the company's history. Meanwhile, the ex-CEO retreated into invisibility. His office was cleared out overnight. By Tuesday morning, the keys had been returned and his nameplate removed. I learned later he spent the weekend in a small hotel, fielding calls from board members who'd privately confessed they'd been trapped by his persona, but relieved to cut ties in the open. He'd never believed someone like me could bring him down, never bothered to look beyond the public metrics he so carefully curated. Now he was gone, a cautionary tale in corporate arrogance. In my first internal memo as CEO, I announced the formation of an independent review committee tasked with auditing every major contract from the past 5 years. I attached a summary of my own findings, detailed notes on offshore settlements, untested joint ventures, and overlooked if failures to signal that no corner would remain unexamined. I also introduced an anonymous whistleblower hotline, encouraging employees to come forward with any concerns, and pledged to match any fines or penalties personally if they arose from deliberate misconduct that I'd once uncovered. The transformation was immediate. Within days, vendors approached with new contract terms, eager to prove their compliance. Senior staffers who'd once tiptoed around risk now participated in strategy sessions with renewed vigor. And the compliance team, long starved of resources, received an emergency budget to shore up our defenses. I held my first town hall meeting in the grand atrium, packed with employees who had weathered the storm of rumors and distrust. I opened by acknowledging the pain they must have felt when they saw colleagues vanish or projects stalled, then laid out our vision for a transparent culture where performance, not politics, would be rewarded. I introduced the leadership team 5 new executive appointments from within, and without hand promised a quarterly review of our progress, publicly posted on the company intranet. The applause was genuine. I could see smiles replacing wary glances. Meanwhile, in the wider business community, my takeover became a case study in underdog strategy. Podcasts dissected my use of shell entities and proxy votes. Industry blogs praised the precision of my timing. Even university business schools reached out to license the case for teaching materials. I accepted interviews sparingly, always emphasizing that the real heroes were the unsung staffers and mid-level managers who had survived the chaos and stood by me once the smoke cleared. In private, I knew the real triumph was not in ousting the man who'd once mocked my finances, but in rebuilding an institution that had lost its moral compass. At the end of my first hectic week, I walked through the main trading floor, where analysts chatted excitedly about new product lines and client outreach programs. I passed cubicles once stifled by fear and saw open discussions of growth strategies that prioritized sustainability over showmanship. For the first time in years, I felt that the company was on solid ground. I stopped at the window overlooking the bustling street below and reflected on how a few well-placed proxy votes and a perfectly timed filing could topple what felt like an impregnable fortress. But the real lesson was that power belongs to whoever makes the first move when the foundations begin to crumble. And I had moved first overnight, quietly and decisively, turning his overconfidence into my greatest advantage. From the moment the overnight filings hit the newswires, the shockwaves rippled through every corner of Meridian Analytics. By sunrise, headlines screamed about a stealth takeover, an analyst becomes CEO overnight. And financial news, channels scrambled to unpack how a woman once dismissed as broke had flipped the script in a single weekend. Social media lit up with chatter. Investors debated whether this was a brilliant coup or a reckless power grab. Employees wondered what it meant for their projects, and competitors quietly recalculated their own strategies. In the trading pits, the ticker paused as brokers double-checked their screens. When the market opened, the stock wobbled down 10% on uncertainty, then up 15% as the promise of transparent leadership captured imaginations. Clients who'd grown wary under the old guard reached out with cautious optimism, asking for reassurances that their accounts would be handled differently now. Internally, the mood swung from stunned disbelief to electric hope. Emails flooded my inbox, not with demands or doubts, but with candid requests. Can we revisit that stalled product line? What's your plan for overdue IT upgrades? Thank you for giving us a chance to speak up. Departments that had once labored under fear now buzzed with energy. I walked the corridors and saw groups huddled in impromptu brainstorming sessions, whiteboards scrawled with new ideas that had languished for months. But for every cheerleader, there was a mourner. On the executive floor, whispers of betrayal lingered. The ex-CEO's most loyal lieutenants felt stunned, some went silent. Others seethed in private calls with each other, wondering how the tables had turned so quickly. A few of the old guard privately warned me that destabilizing a flagship company risked a client exodus or a regulatory backlash. They reminded me that change is a double-edged sword. Fresh leadership can galvanize, but it can also fracture long-standing relationships. Press releases landed in journalists' inboxes within hours of my first memo. I announced an immediate comprehensive audit, a refreshed leadership team, and an open-door policy for anyone with concerns. At the same time, I sat for interviews with two major business outlets. I spoke plainly about the systemic issues I'd uncovered: hidden liabilities, inconsistent risk management, and the need for a culture that valued integrity over optics. I framed the takeover not as revenge but as stewardship. My goal is to restore trust, I said. This company built its reputation on data-driven insights. Now it needs to live up to that standard internally. Those quotes circulated, widely paired with footage of me fielding questions in a sleek boardroom. Some analysts praised my clarity. Others warned that laying corporate skeletons bare so publicly could scare off investors. Even so, the net reaction leaned positive. Trust in the brand ticked upward in early sentiment surveys. On LinkedIn, a stream of posts celebrated the underdog triumph. This is what real leadership looks like. Finally, accountability at the top. Can't wait to see what she does next. Hashtags like #NewEra at Meridian and #BreakTheGlass-Ceiling trended briefly in finance circles. Meanwhile, the ex-CEO's supporters rallied to defend him. What about continuity? This will destroy client confidence, they argued. A handful of institutional investors voiced public concern, calling for special shareholder meetings to demand more details. I responded by pledging full transparency. Ask your questions and I'll answer them, I wrote in an open letter. Shared on the company blog, that standoff only fueled media interest further. In the halls of venture capital firms, partners speculated on whether this bold move would inspire similar coups at other companies, or whether it would backfire spectacularly. A couple of hedge funds quietly took short positions, betting that the instability would depress the stock in the weeks to come. But as the dust settled, a clearer picture emerged. Within days, a mid-tier client that had been on the fence signed a multi-year extension, citing confidence in the new leadership's commitment to ethical practices. Two former employees returned as contractors, offering to help with the audit and public relations. Even some of the board members who had initially resisted my proposal publicly expressed relief. We needed a reset. One of them said in a press quote. The murmur of dissent shifted to cautious support, yet none of that prepared me for the personal fallout. Friends and mentors reached out to congratulate me, but each call was tinged with concern. Are you prepared for the scrutiny? They'll be looking for any slip-up to discredit you. I felt the weight of every eye, expecting hidden cameras and planted investigators. Late one night, I found an anonymous message in my inbox with a doctored photo, my name superimposed. On a scandalous headline, the sender claimed they had more dirt to share. If I didn't step down, they'd leak it. I forwarded the message to our security team and notified legal counsel, but I didn't let it shake me. I knew my dossier was airtight still. The threat was a stark reminder that taking power brings new dangers. Then came the employees' town hall. I stood on the stage in front of hundreds of staffers, some excited, some skeptic land. I laid out the roadmap, a month-by-month checklist of the audit process, milestones for IT upgrades, and a schedule of open forum sessions. I spoke about fostering a culture of accountability, not fear. About rewarding teams for flagging issues rather than hiding them. About creating a workplace where being wrong was better than being silent. The applause was genuine. But as I stepped off the stage, an HR manager pulled me aside. Someone had tried to bribe her to slant the talking points in favor of the ex-CEO. They'd offered her a hefty bonus for planting friendly questions in the queue, and that revelation felt like a punch to the gut, proof that the old regime was still attempting to undermine me from the shadows. I thanked her for her honesty and assured her we'd handle it appropriately. I realized then that the public reveal wasn't a finish line. It was just a starting pistol. Exposing the takeover thrust me into a storm of celebration and backlash, loyalty and sabotage. Investors and employees rallied, but so did saboteurs. Clients expressed optimism, but rivals watched for every misstep. The public narrative split into two camps, those who saw me as a visionary reformer and those who branded me a corporate raider. The press coverage intensified, with late-night talk shows floating jokes about the analyst queen and podcasts questioning whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew. Yet through it all, the company's fundamentals kept improving. Our first week of transparent earnings guidance beat Wall Street's estimates. Key risk metrics stabilized. Employee engagement surveys rose. Those results spoke louder than any scandal. And as the initial frenzy faded into the steady hum of progress, it became clear that the real impact of the public reveal lay in how we responded, not in the shock of the takeover itself, but in the deliberate steps we took afterward. Because, in the world of high-stakes corporate drama, momentum matters most, and this momentum was just the beginning. But that tectonic shift was only part of the story. The more I dug into the fallout from the takeover, the more I realized there was a buried motive behind every misstep he'd made, and every fire I'd put out. It started when our newly appointed audit committee unearthed a series of internal memos from his tenure, memos that painted a far darker picture than even I had imagined. One document, dated nearly 2 years before my proxy coup, outlined a secret directive from him to inflate quarterly earnings by shifting revenue recognition into earlier periods. It was a bold maneuver, something straight out of a rogue trader's playbook, but instead of investing in new products or shoring up our technology, he'd chosen to massage the numbers so he could announce record growth and bask in the limelight. I watched as the audit team cross-referenced that directive with our financial statements, then traced a paper trail of altered invoices, phantom consulting fees, and backdated contracts that all fed into the same slush fund. They weren't collateral expenses or innocuous rounding errors. They were willful deceptions, orchestrated to prop up a facade of success. As word of these findings spread, I convened an impromptu press call, standing in front of the company's restored logo, one we'd replaced after the coup to symbolize a fresh start. I held up the directive memo. This, I told the assembled reporters, is not the sign of innovative leadership. It's the sign of desperation. And it's why we're here today, to put an end to the era of cover-ups and half-truths. The reaction was instantaneous. Headlines the next morning read: exposed, CEO's secret earnings scheme and Meridian's phantom revenues revealed. Stock analysts downgraded the company on the spot. Not because they thought we were bankrupt, but because they believed they'd been misled for years. Institutions that had once dismissed our red flags overnight demanded board seats to oversee the corrective measures, but that public reckoning was only half the story. Behind closed doors, I discovered that his actions hadn't just harmed shareholders, they had endangered real people. A client came forward, an NGO that had partnered with us on a large data analysis grant, claiming they'd based policy recommendations on reports generated by our flawed models. Those models, we later learned, had been trained on skewed data. After he fired the only statistician who refused to rubber stamp bad inputs, the NGO's project collapsed, its findings discredited in the press, and dozens of vulnerable communities lost funding because the analytics didn't pan out. As I listened to their director's voice crack over the phone, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. This wasn't about power games or corporate titans. It was about real lives reliant on the integrity of our work. That realization crystallized my true motive. I hadn't seized control of Meridian to settle scores. I'd done it to save a legacy built on data-driven decisions and real-world impact that was being eroded by one man's ego. When I laid out the corrective plan to the board, I didn't frame it as damage control. I called it Project Redemption. We allocated $10 million to rebuild our analytics models from the ground up, invested in a new data ethics committee staffed by external experts, and committed to publishing all future methodologies in an open access journal. I insisted that every project we delivered include a third-party verification stamp, a commitment no longer to rely on internal approvals alone. The board approved those measures unanimously, some, I suspect, out of fear of further scandal, others because they finally saw the importance of real accountability. But the most powerful moment came when I addressed the company in our first all-hands meeting since the takeover. I didn't recite talking points or recycle sound bites. Instead, I shared the story of the NGO of communities who had banked on our reputation and been let down. I spoke softly, almost as if confessing a collective failure, and asked every person in that room to join me in rebuilding trust, brick by brick. No slogans, no corporate platitudes, just a promise to do better. The applause was the loudest I've ever heard in my career. Yet, even as we rallied around Project Redemption, the old guard didn't disappear quietly. A wave of senior executives quietly resigned rather than participate in the overhaul, and a handful of them began murmuring in industry circles that I was overreacting, that nobody else cared so much about ethics. Their thinly veiled smears threatened to cast doubt on our renewed commitment. So I made a counteroffer. Any stakeholder with genuine evidence of wrongdoing would receive an anonymous hotline to report it, with guaranteed protection and a $50,000 reward if their information led to concrete changes. That move silenced most critics. Nobody wanted to be seen as the person blocking progress, while empowering whistleblowers to surface the last vestiges of the old regime's rot. Within weeks, we'd uncovered 2 more illicit partnerships he had greenlit without due diligence, each one funneling millions into unvetted shell companies. Those revelations triggered targeted investigations, resulting in 5 former execs facing civil charges for breach of fiduciary duty. It was a bitter vindication. The man who laughed at my bank account had left behind a trail of financial carnage, all neatly papered over until I pried it open. But for me, the real victory wasn't in watching them account for their misdeeds. It was in turning those scandals into a foundation for lasting reform. By exposing his worst actions, we rebuilt the company's credibility from the ground up. Clients that had withdrawn accounts lined up to return, impressed by our radical transparency. New partnerships blossomed with nonprofits and research institutions eager to tap our renewed integrity. And internally, we saw a shift too. Employees who once felt silenced now served as our eyes and ears. Flagging issues early and keeping us honest, the transformation was dramatic. In the next quarterly report, we acknowledged a temporary dip in revenue as a result of corrective write-downs, but our long-term projections soared. Investors rewarded us with renewed confidence, pushing the stock past its pre-coup highs, and as I stood on the balcony of my new office overlooking the same skyline, where he once waved like a triumphant king, I realized that my greatest coup had been not just taking his throne, but using that power to cleanse the very foundation of the empire he'd built. He had taught me that unchecked ambition can erode even the sturdiest structures. I taught the world that integrity once restored can be the strongest bulwark of all. The truth is, power shifts not with a roar, but with a whisper, and by the time the world heard my name in the boardroom, the real move had already been made. I started as the rookie analyst, no one took seriously, underestimated because of a bank balance they assumed was empty. They laughed at me, they mocked my background. Yet every slight, every offhand jab about my finances became the fuel that drove me to dig deeper, to map out hidden liabilities, to build shell entities and assemble silent backers. I didn't burst through the front door of Meridian Analytics. I slipped through the back, unlocking every hidden door, while everyone else watched the founder's PR show. When the final proxy votes were cast and my name took the top slot on the shareholder registry, it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was proof that the greatest vulnerabilities lie not in flashy weaknesses, but in the cracks we ignore. In the aftermath, as headlines dissected the stealth takeover, I embraced a new challenge, transforming a crumbling empire into a model of transparency and integrity. Exposing the hush money settlements and misreported earnings was only the first step. I refused to let the company's history of shortcuts define its future. Project Redemption wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise to rebuild from the ground up. We poured resources into overhauling analytics models, established an external ethics committee, and created whistleblower channels that guaranteed protection. We swapped dog-on-pony investor presentations for candid Q&A sessions, admitting past mistakes and laying out a roadmap for genuine stability. Each initiative reinforced a single truth: if you cut corners today, you'll pay for it tomorrow, and the people who rely on your data deserve better than corporate spin. That radical transparency paid off in unexpected ways. Clients who'd once considered jumping ship returned, impressed by our willingness to publish methodologies and invite third-party verification. New partnerships formed with NGOs seeking ethical data partners. Investors who had shorted our stock discovered that honesty can be the most compelling driver of long-term growth. Internally, the mood shifted from guarded skepticism to genuine collaboration. Teams that had endured a culture of fear now surfaced problems with pride. Technical folks volunteered to spearhead security upgrades. Legal counsel signed off on open access policy filings, and junior analysts began mapping out proactive risk indicators. Our open-door town halls became a proving ground for fresh ideas, not a stage for rehearsed speeches. And yet, my journey didn't end at the boardroom table. The final lesson was personal. What begins as a vendetta can evolve into a mission. I never set out merely to exact revenge on the man who scoffed at my bank account. I set out to reclaim what his arrogance had jeopardized: the integrity of every spreadsheet, the trust of every client, and the livelihoods tied to our analytics. In seizing control, I gave a second life to the company's founding vision that valued data as a force for good, not a prop for egos. So why does this matter to you? Because the story of that broken analyst who bought her own company is more than corporate drama. It's a mirror for any situation where someone underestimates you, where whispered rumors threaten to define your worth, or where hidden flaws go unchecked until they threaten collapse. The power to change the narrative doesn't require thunderous confrontation. It requires patience, precision, and a willingness to operate in the shadows until the moment to step into the light arrives. Ask yourself, when someone dismisses you as powerless, will you internalize that judgment or let it become your catalyst? When you uncover a systemic weakness, whether in a firm, a relationship, or even a personal habit, will you ignore it for the sake of comfort or tackle it head-on, knowing that doing so may ruffle feathers? And perhaps most importantly, when you finally hold the keys to change, will you wield that power for personal vindication alone, or will you use it to elevate the entire system around you? Because real leadership isn't the ability to fly solo, it's the capacity to transform decay into renewal. It's one thing to topple a pedestal built on sand. It's another to replace that sandcastle with a foundation of stone. The analyst, who became CEO, didn't just unseat a kingpin. She restored an institution to purpose. And that's a lesson that plays out far beyond corporate boardrooms and teams. In communities, in families, and in every arena where influence and integrity collide. If there's one takeaway I want you to hold on to, it's this. Underestimation is your greatest asset. When people doubt you, they reveal their own blind spots. They expose the weaknesses they'd rather ignore. Don't rush to prove them wrong in the heat of the moment. Let them dig their trenches, speak their half-truths, and parade their illusions of dominance. Meanwhile, build quietly, gather knowledge, cultivate allies, fortify your resources, and when the critical mass is reached, don't announce your arrival with fanfare. Move with the subtlety of a turning tide. The world will hear the results all on its own. In the end, he learned the hard way that arrogance tastes sweetest on paper and turns bitter in reality. I learned that power untethered from principle is perilous, but power harnessed for renewal can be transformative. And you, watching this story, have the chance to apply these principles wherever you face hidden vulnerabilities and open opportunities. The next time they laugh at your balance sheet, let it fuel you. The next time they whisper broke, let it remind you that every empire can crumble and every underdog can rise. So here's my final question for you. If you discovered your world was built on overlooked flaws, what would you rebuild first? And when the moment comes to chart a new course, will you choose the path of quiet strategy or the glare of a head-on confrontation? Because lurking in that choice is the secret to shifting power and to turning every doubt into your greatest advantage.